We're gonna be stuck here with this bill, and the deadline we have before us is the priorities letter. I think it was not communicated a while ago. The exec has changed his press conference twice, but yeah, I think there's characteristically too much on the agenda, and then nothing on the agenda next week. So, yeah, I apologize.
Well, there's a 3 o'clock press conference about coronavirus.
That was canceled, that was moved to 6.
It was.
That was the
It
Facebook
3,
Live
now it's
event.
6,
That was-
and it's
What
back
what
to
time
3.
is the press conference about coronavirus?
6.
So there is no 3 o'clock press conference. Okay.
Right, no, I'm sorry, I was told there was only executive drafts coming across the street for the briefing. I'm not sure you want to wait around an hour and a half anyway, so, sorry, I was told there was only executive staff coming across the street for the. Go ahead, Glenn. Right,
Priorities letter first, then? I'm confused. Is that word?
I did not realize that the press conference was not on, so
It's,
my previous
I was just
comments
informed that it
were,
goes to, it's been moved to 6.
Okay.
It's been moved
so
twice already.
Now I no longer think that we can't do both, so however you want to proceed.
We don't have all the staff for the bill here. right
Okay,
now.
well then never mind.
Oh, you don't?
So,
Priorities letter.
so then cancel the bill.
Well, you can do it during this meeting, but they're not here at this moment because they expected it to be second.
And I know some members from the planning department because of the cancellation.
Okay, so
Okay,
priorities letter?
so we can take up the bill later. Councilmember Friedson has to come either way. He's here for the priorities letter too. We have a statutory deadline for the priorities letter, which is overdue.
Correct.
We should just begin with that, right?
Sure.
Great.
Okay.
Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. Any violent opposition to that? Okay, great. Not yet. Dr. Orland,
Thank you.
proceed.
Again, this is a letter which actually is required by law every year, but we don't do it every year. No one's gone to jail yet. We basically do it whenever there's a change in the council or the executive, or there's some other pressing reason to change the letter. What this letter is a joint letter, signed both the executive and the council, expressing our ranking of transportation priorities which should be funded by the state. Last one was done in summer of 2017. And that's on Circle 1 to 6 of the packet. Chris Conklin, the Director of DOT, drafted a draft version of the new letter back in November. He consequently, after that, went to talk to the planning board, planning staff. They had a review in December. Their letter and the planning staff's packet is also in this packet. He took those comments into account, and he's also talked with members of the delegation, some members of the delegation and Senate who've reached out and basically tried to incorporate at least some of those comments. There were some disagreements that were not included. And so I think if you bear with us, maybe have Chris summarize where the executive is at. You're serving as the executive's representative, so.
Sure.
And then maybe Steve Aldrich from the planning staff could weigh in for a couple of minutes about where the planning board and staff was. And then I would wrap up in terms of the staff presentation, in terms of a couple of comments that I would make that are different than what you see from DOT and the executive. So,
Thank you.
Chris.
Sure. So the major changes that we made to the letter this year are the order in which we present our priorities. In the past, we started based on the size of the state program. So it started with the highways program and then went down to the ped and bike program because it has the smallest amount of state funding. We've revised that order in this letter to better match the county's priorities, starting with transit, pedestrian, bike, local highways, and then the interstate program to better communicate our priorities. The major changes that happened since the last letter, the purple line is well under construction. It had not begun construction when the last letter was drafted. The I-270 495 proposal had not been advanced by the state at that time. So that's a major change. And the WMATA capital funding agreement was not in place at the last letter. So that's a major change since the last letter. So those items have a different treatment or perhaps a lower priority in how they're addressed in this version of the letter. Many of the other projects in this letter are the same as have been there before because typically we see 1 to 3 of our priorities funded in between letters, and we have 15 to 20 listed here. So the list of things that we'd like to see done is not dramatically different from letter to letter, although there are changes from one to the next. One of the, if I talk about the highway priorities, one of the things that has moved significantly up in this draft is the Forest Glen improvements to Georgia Avenue, which is providing pedestrian and bicycle facilities between the Beltway and 16th Street, and eliminating the reversible lane configuration that's in there. That's been a state planning project that has been advanced over time. There was some discussion with SHA last year about a build grant for that program, which was not advanced by the state at that time, but we have identified that in this draft as the top priority. Not present in the last letter was the 117 Clopper Road improvements. That project had been around, dropped out at the last letter because it hadn't advanced in quite some time. Ironically, the next two Chapter 30 submissions that the department did, when Chapter 30 is how the county identifies the projects they would like to see advanced into the Consolidated Transportation Program, included Clopper Road, given the imminent opening of the Watkins Mill interchange, the support from the city of Gaithersburg, and that the state had completed its planning phase work on that. So that is back in the letter this time. It hadn't been in here before. Other changes that are in here new to the letter this year are an emphasis on state traffic signal modernization. Many of the signals are in a structurally deficient condition or still have incandescent lamping. We would like to see an acceleration of the state's program to replace and improve the traffic signal system that we end up maintaining but that they own. And then another new project in here this year is the Laytonsville bypass, which the town of Laytonsville in their plan had identified a relocation of of 108 through Laytonsville, and that is included as the newest project at the end of that priorities list. There's an emphasis on Vision Zero in here in terms of BIPA and improvements to pedestrian and bike safety on State Highway. Perhaps the language not as strong as it could be, and the planning board commented on that, so I'll let Steve talk a little bit more about those objectives. There's an element in here about the locally operated transit support, which is new to the letter this year. The locally operated transit support is about a third of Ride-On's operating funding and about $2 million of bus replacement funding. And we have also identified a need for, or a desire for, state participation in helping us develop electrical capacity for transition of fleet to electric vehicles over time. So that's new. We have a little less emphasis on WMATA in this letter because the funding agreement had occurred since the last letter, but emphasize the desire to see WMATA fund. In this draft, it's the both White Flint and Forest Glen packages. In our comments on their capital budget, we only included the White Flint station. And then I think that's kind of the major issues that are different from last time. I have not tried to catch up the treatment of the managed lanes to its current state because I want to make that the current state at the time we send this. So the language about the managed lanes does not reflect the most recent Board of Public Works language in this draft, which is the change in phasing of that project so that the Legion Bridge and 270 components are first, and that they have to reach a memorandum of agreement with the county about a contribution to locally operated transit before the Board of Public Works approves those contracts. So that will be in here, but it's not in here now just because of the lag between when this was developed and the current state of that effort. I won't spend any more time describing this because I'm sure Glenn has his analysis and you may have other questions.
What other detail have you received from the state recently about the Managed Lanes project?
I actually have not received very much information at all since the Board of Public Works meeting, and I know they have issued the RFQ, so the qualification stage for P3 bidders, and they're beginning the process for the P3 procurement. But there hasn't been a lot of direct engagement about the funding memorandum of understanding.
Same answer as I asked you last time.
Yeah, and we do expect the environmental impact statement to be released shortly. I know it has been with the Planning Commission for their official review as a cooperating agency, but it hasn't been released in a public manner.
Have you been in touch with the resource that the Secretary has assigned to negotiate the MOU with us?
I don't know who that is. I'm assuming it's going to be Lisa Choplin, the P3 program director, but there hasn't been any substantive conversation about that memo yet.
Right. I've talked to the secretary a couple times, and he keeps saying it's coming very soon, so, okay.
We are actually contemplating developing a draft
Okay.
independently.
A draft, oh, yeah, why wouldn't we?
Yeah,
Besides just.
it's always
when
nice
on
to have the pen.
your- Yes, okay.
Steve Aldridge with the Planning Department, Functional Planning and Policy Division. Back in December, the Planning Board prepared a review of state priorities. And unfortunately, at that time, we did not have the draft letter from DOT, so we actually used the previous one sort of as our comparison. We made several recommendations.
It was provided.
It was provided,
Yeah.
Okay. The planning board had some slightly different priorities, but I think the primary priority was Vision Zero. The need for emphasis on prioritizing Vision Zero projects on state highway corridors, that's definitely in the letter. There might be some disagreement about where it's presented, but certainly a lot of the same words. The planning board did point out that there is no dedicated funding source at SHA for Vision Zero projects. When House Bill 855 was passed by the state, there was no accompanying funding source. So there's a drastically different level of effort, between toward zero deaths and Vision Zero, and there's been no programmatic changes to address that. And we think that's important to point that out in this letter, that they, not just for us, but from a statewide perspective, they need to, provide a dedicated funding source and prioritize these type of projects. The planning board did identify a project that's not in the draft letter from Mr. Conklin, which is the road diet on 16th Street. With the ongoing work of SHA on George Avenue, working on that project, and the construction of the Purple Line station on 16th Street, we feel like there's going to be a gap. And in order to design the bicycle lanes on 16th Street, we feel like a road diet will be needed. And also, we're starting to look at, we have 2 lanes in each direction at the district. We're going to have 2 lanes in each direction at the Purple Line station. And right now, the 3 lanes on Georgia and 3 lanes on 16th Street feeding into the Montgomery Hills, we're essentially creating, we've created Montgomery Hills as one big bottleneck. So trying to meter the flow, we feel like a road diet should be considered, and that it should be prioritized at least closely behind the Montgomery Hills project. The planning board did also ask about separating the 28 and 198 corridors project. We feel like the Burtonsville project is of a higher level of priority compared to the other segments of the corridor, and that project should be advanced sooner. And it's actually probably more ready to go, and certainly with the council's consideration of the access road project, we think that there's a logical tie-in and a need to tie that together and advance it in a coordinated fashion, separate from the rest of the 28, 198 corridor.
So just to be clear, it was 5. You don't want it to be 6 and 7. You want it to be.
We just like to see the 198 section a higher priority than the 28 section.
So Chris's recommendation is conforms with that. I mean, you may want to move them higher up the list, but in terms of putting one in front of the other, that's what
That's a
the recommendation is now.
But I'm sorry, Steve, were you saying they should both be higher or not? Or you just care about the prioritization of the within the 2?
We care more about the Burtonsville section.
Yeah.
However the other one works out, I don't think the planning board really spoke to that. The planning board did address dedicated funding as part of the Managed Lanes project. And of course, a lot of things have changed, but certainly more detail. I think that's one thing that the planning board feels pretty strongly, that there needs to be a definite plan of how we can actually get the transit projects rolling as soon as possible, and guarantee that funding. The Georgia Avenue Norbeck interchange, so the planning board was pretty much lowered that to the bottom of the list of highway improvements. And the last recommendation the planning board made in terms of the highway projects is actually asked for a numerical ranking of all transportation priorities, not in the different buckets. So that, because I think when these letters first started to come out, counties would give a list, and the list would be everything in one pot. We want an interchange here, we want a bus line here. And I think Montgomery County was one of the first counties to actually sort of elevate that and say, well, you know, these are dedicated funding sources, and within the funding source we have a priority. But the comments that we actually heard back from SHA was, we can't figure out what you want the most. So I don't know, I get the message from the planning board is if there's a way to, when you're done, say, here's our entire list, but, you know, and
We could probably send it both ways. Director Conklin?
We haven't found that having it numerically ranked that way helps us, and we find that our letter becomes very confusing because we have a very hard time agreeing as to the sequence when we mix up the projects in the different funding categories. And in some ways, saying that they don't know what our priority is, so they're not funding something, is a bit of an excuse for not funding something more than it is not understanding what is important to us.
And ironically, we used to, years and years ago, do the letters like Steve's talking about, which is just rank order every project. And it was the State Highway Administrator, Neil Peterson, who told us 15 years ago that really it would serve our purposes better if we broke them out in different categories. And so we've been doing it that way ever since.
There you go.
the last item to mention is that individual planning board commissioners did identify, I guess, their priorities slightly different from the entire board. Commissioner Patterson, she felt like the 117 Clapper Road improvement should be higher on the list. And Commissioner Sishi identified his concern that third tracking of the Brunswick line should be a higher priority or should just be a very high priority. And he mentioned not just third tracking, but a short-term option to do layover track sidings, sort of before you have the room to do the full third track, to periodically put in sidings to improve the capacity of the line.
Okay.
I'll just speak a little bit to the art of putting this together. It's a combination of the impact of the project, the readiness of the project, and the likelihood of the project getting funded that drive how we rank things. So something like the third tracking can have a very, very significant impact, but its likelihood is not that high based on the one county priority, given the scale of the investment needed. So that's kind of part of the reason they're structured that way. And this letter presents that particular item into the benefit that's achieved by that, which is the all-day service and higher frequency of service on the Brunswick line, rather than the infrastructure that has been said to need that could also be provided through changing the agreement with CSX, which is costly as well, but to get more slots within the existing infrastructure. So we weren't trying to get into the specific of you need a siding in Gaithersburg to make this happen, as we were, this is the outcome we want for the transit service. So that's one element. And the Vision Zero component,
Does Frederick have a position on that?
not that I'm aware of. They should, but I'm not aware of their position.
You haven't been in touch with them?
I haven't asked, no. Vision Zero, we have no argument with the planning board's suggestions and agree that the language can be strengthened. 28-198, as Glenn will say, we're okay with separating that. I'm trying to remember what else you brought up. Spring Street, or 16th Street, no issue with the project that they're describing. It just isn't, in our view, ready to make its way into the letter. It may be an ideal candidate next time, when and if we have traction on our top priority, which is the Georgia Avenue component, and if a little bit more analysis of what specifically we're asking for has been developed. So,
What about the argument that by not doing anything on 16th Street, you're bringing a bottleneck essentially to a newly redesigned Georgia Avenue?
we have that bottleneck now.
We do.
We absolutely
We don't like it.
Georgia and 16th come together, and I don't really think we know enough about what the implications of this are now to propose it as a new project.
Yeah, I will mention, we had a pre-mandatory referral meeting with SHA this morning. And one of the things we asked them to look at and address is justifying the need on northbound 16th Street at Georgia Avenue for 3 left turn lanes versus 2 left turn lanes. What's really driving that need? Is it needed just for an intersection purpose, or is it needed for corridor flow? And so when they're going to submit, we're not sure, it might be a month, it might be a little longer, but we've asked them to make sure that they address that issue, because certainly when you look at how congested and how this corridor backs up today, we want to make sure that the improvements that they're designing work as a system and work much more effectively than it currently does.
How could it be corridor flow if it's coming out of 2 lanes just a mile south of there in DC?
Well, there's a lot of new traffic
Missing
added from
something?
Silver Spring as well.
Is there?
Yeah,
Okay.
as it gets to that area.
West Highway?
Off East West Highway, okay, fair enough.
Well, I think we're not quite sure that the effective number of lanes justifies 3.
Yeah.
And we think that with the restriction at DC, the restriction that will occur as a result of the Purple Line station, and then just the restricted flow through Montgomery Hills, that it might make sense to meter it by enacting the road diet.
And again, I'm not arguing the merits of this. It may be a perfectly reasonable project, and everything that's been said may be true. We're just not quite sure what we're asking for at this time, and a little bit more time to pass in the SHA study and other things that happen when the Purple Line opens. We'll have a better understanding of what we're working with here, because there hasn't been any, beyond the master plan recommendation, which nobody opposed at the time, there hasn't been any assessment of what it is we're seeking from the project.
And SHA will study it?
They'll likely study the components Steve has asked for, but they're not going to study the entire corridor.
Right.
Their limits right now on 16th Street is Grace Church Road, so it's
Okay.
very short.
Yeah.
Just real quickly, my only comments, I basically concur with where DOT is at with the 5 specific recommended changes. And again, on page 2 of the packet, you see the order from the 2017 letter, and where it says proposed, that's DOT's thinking as of now, not based on the November letter, but as modified by the comments that came in from the...
Have you always done the chart?
Pardon me?
The chart's great. Have you always done the chart? I didn't
No, this is
realize.
a new chart.
The chart's very helpful.
You'll see, in the council packet, you'll see 4 columns, so...
You're giving us a lot of credit.
Oh, there you go. You'll see it. Anyway, this is really a shorthand because there's other kinds of nuances in here in terms of like language for the interstate program, for the traffic relief studies, language for Vision Zero, there's language for the MARC station stuff. So it's there'll be more than just this, but this is the shorthand version of it. The 5 things I'm recommending. One is heard Chris refer to it. I think the 117 project should be the #1 project, and the other state highways for the reasons he mentioned it. What Watkins Road interchange is going to open very shortly. It's going to bring a lot of traffic to that section of Clopper Road. The intersection at Watkinsville and Clopper will likely be overtaxed, as well as particularly the intersections of Clopper and First Field and Quince Orchard. And the city of Gaithersburg agrees. They've sent in a letter. It's on Circle 20. It's one of the attachments, actually, that I put out to you, advocating that be the #1, which then taking Chris's list, the #1 there, which is the Montgomery Hills project, would be #2, which is still 2 spots higher than it was in the 2017 letter. It would go from 4 to 2. And then #3 would be the widening of 355 from Milestone and Germantown up to Clarksburg, and #4 would be the new project that DOT is recommending, which is the accelerated traffic signal modernization, and then 5 through 9 would be the same. I'm just going to get all the recommendations out and then talk about it some more. Secondly, in the WMATA category, I would not include the Forest Glen Passageway as part of the #1 priority because it's already funded. It's funded in the approved CIP. It's recommended we fund on the same schedule, same cost in the proposed CIP. So why ask for state money for something we've already funded? And it takes attention away from the White Flint Northern Entrance, which is not funded. And secondly, I would add as a #2, basically bring back the Metro Bus Priority Corridor Network item, but specifically Reviersville Road. This is something we've been asking for a number of years. Ms. Navarro's asked for it. I think Al Roshton was director, asked the state for it, and they turned us down then. And this would be state money because it's basically state money buying Metro buses to be able to operate this ride-on extra type service on Viersville Road from Wheaton to Rockville and perhaps up to Montgomery College in Rockville. The that's the second and third recommendations. The fourth recommendation is similar to, under commuter rail, similar to my comment about the Forest Glen Passageway. Number one then and now is the Boyd Station expansion. Well, it's recommended to be funded by the executive with county funds, completion by FY '25. The committee is recommending also doing it actually a year sooner by FY '24. Why ask for state money for something we are certainly going to cover? I should say that I had conversations with Councilman Rice, who would like to keep this in here in case the Boyd's Transit Center somehow falls out of the CIP before we're done. Your judgment on this, but my judgment is it's not going to fall out. It's still going to be there. So I would recommend taking that out as the number one priority, and then the other three would become 1, 2, and 3. And so number one would be the midday and off-peak service for MARC, including the third track and the sidings and that sort of thing, which is a big ask, but it's it's probably the most important thing of the remaining things on the list, and it's one of the things that Ben Ross's letter refers to, the Maryland Transit Opportunities Coalition. And then the final thing I would change is under local operating transit support. I totally agree with Chris's number one priority, which is the funding for the electric charging stations at the 2 depots. But a number 2 priority should be essentially state funding to help fund expanding our ride-on extra, which is on 355. So it's the same kind of thing as the Veersmill Road one, except now it's 355. And right now, as you know, the 101, the ride-on extra runs from Lake Forest down to Medical Center. And I would hope we could ask for state funds to help at least buy the buses and perhaps pay for the upgraded stations from Lake Forest up to Germantown and from Medical Center down to Bethesda CBD. Again, mirroring the route that the BRT will eventually be, both in the case of Metrobus for Veersmill Road and 355 in this case. So those are my 5 recommendations. Otherwise, totally agree with what Chris and the exec is recommending. And then we should probably, if we could, go through just refer to the 4 additional pieces of paper that I put on your chairs in front of you. And the first one, Mr. Friedson, I'm sure will want to talk to, which has to do with the interstate highway program, having to do specifically with Carter Rock Springs and noise protection. So, Mr. Hucker, unless you have any questions.
Do you think it would make sense to go through the 4 that we talked about first before we go to the other ones?
Which 4 that we talked about?
The ones Glenn,
His recommendation? He's got 5, right? Oh, 4, beg your
I
pardon.
see 4 bullets.
5 paragraphs, 4 bullets, right, okay, fair enough.
Paragraphs 5. We can do that.
We can do that. Can you, before we get into specifics, because 2 of them fall in this bucket, do you want to speak to your reaction to the theory that by including things on the priorities letter that the state, that the county may fund but has not yet funded, even though we intend to, given that the state hasn't funded it yet. Right. What's the danger in that?
I don't think there's...
Dr. Erlin thinks there's a danger that we're distracting them.
I don't think there's a danger. I mean, Forest Glen, I think, is further along. I tend to agree with his view that that's different than the metro station itself. It's actually separate from the metro station. We had that argument last year, and it's gotten closer to reality. The Whiteflint Metro Station, I think, is a totally different animal because that's entirely metro facilities that would be constructed. And those are really advice to the secretary as our board member to try to encourage participation in those more than anything. In terms of Boyd's, we have a letter from MTA suggesting they will cooperate with us on doing the rail side improvements. So I would want to keep this in because we want to keep them motivated to do improvements to the station itself. We are doing parking and access improvements, but we're not touching the rail facilities. So that's part of the reason I'd like to retain that. In the other state highways, Cooper versus Georgia, they're both projects with strong merit for different reasons. One is primarily a capacity expansion. The other is taming an unfriendly road and creating pedestrian and bike facilities closer to the urban core. It was our estimation that purpose was a higher priority to the county than the capacity, but again, they're both meritorious projects. So I don't know that there's a big win or loss if you switch those priorities, but that was the justification behind them. getting additional transit operating support or capital for extra type services. I don't think there's any argument with that. We had argued for quite some time for Metro to do that with additional state funding. We haven't been successful, and you're all very familiar with their current budget proposal. We were hoping they would use some of the $25 million that they've reduced the transit component or the bus component to rail to do these types of services. They did very little of that. So we're disappointed by that outcome, but this is consistent with the direction we've had for quite some time.
All right, so we can go through each of Glenn's recommended changes, but can I ask you about a couple things that jump out at me that aren't on there? One is we have BRT for Veers Mill and New Hampshire and 355. There it is. We have long wanted the state to invest some of their money correctly on the US 29 corridor, a US highway run by the state, right? That's not on there. We've taken on all that responsibility ourselves. It still needs redesign. If it's going to, two members of this committee have written a letter to you saying to hurry up and finish your study.
Yes.
There's the study, there's the redesign, there's the construction that'll follow that. Why aren't we asking for any money on US 29?
We don't ask it specifically for any corridor. We ask it broadly for state financial participation in the program.
Well, because you mean because we're combining them now?
Yeah, because we don't have a favorite child at the moment among those. We need
Sure.
their participation and support in all of those.
It doesn't have its own line item.
It does not have its own
If
line
we're going to lump them together, why not?
It is first.
It is getting billed first, yeah.
And it's first in the list that's here. But it's not called out bullet by corridor.
Which list are you looking at? Under BRT, it begins with Corridor Cities Transitway,
That's the old letter.
right?
No, it's
Oh, on your new proposed.
Flash on 29 is the first.
Got it. Okay, fine. Thank you. And then farther up there, would that include any parking enhancements in Burtonsville, the northern terminus?
Not explicitly listed here, but it's not unreasonable to include that.
It's not unreasonable. Why wouldn't we want to include that? That's a big need, and it's a bi-county need because Howard County needs that,
Those are
and
good
Prince
points.
George's.
Those are good points.
I would recommend including that.
We had been focused on the changes to the road itself, but that's a good addition.
There's also private development interest, 3 different parties that are interested in investing some of their money in that area, and they're, I don't want to say waiting on, they would be incentivized if there was additional state investment in the structured parking there,
Sure.
right?
Yep.
So why wouldn't we want to signal our interest in this?
I don't sit here today having a reason why we wouldn't want to do that.
Thank you. Okay, so the first one, Maryland 117 versus Georgia Avenue.
We really should think of the top 4 because right now Maryland 117 is number 4 in the executive's letter, and Montgomery Hills is number 1. And my proposal was to make 4 number 1, and then make number 1 number 2, and number 2 number 3, number 3 number 4. So it's not really a 1-for-1. You have to look at the top 4.
Mr. Conklin?
Well, as I mentioned, we felt that the Georgia Avenue better matched our overall priorities of multimodal than Quapper.
Right.
But Quapper has been our submittal the last 2 times for inclusion in the CTP. It's a needed project.
I think the Montgomery Hills prioritization aligns very well with the long-awaited state highway redesign and study there, and that those communities have waited since the 70s.
State highway is currently active there where they're not currently active on Quapper.
Exactly. So I like it your way.
I do as well. We're very close, I hope, to a breakthrough with Georgia Avenue and getting the state to come through. We've been doing an intense amount of work around it with the Forest Glen Master Plan that we've recently adopted. We've got a lot of community activism. It's very helpful. We've got community members inviting, the Secretary of Commerce out and then talking to the Department of Transportation. So, we've got a lot of momentum on this project. I think now is a good time to try to break through and get this thing resolved. So, I definitely concur. So I think we should do that. The interchange is now complete, and as Glenn says, there could be an issue going forward, we can keep our eye on that and, return to it as circumstances warrant.
Mr. Glass?
I concur.
Okay.
Also, let me try my alternative, which could you move 117 to number 2?
What's that?
And it's not a one-for-one thing. I'm trying to move 117 up. And if Montgomery Hills is number 1, could 117 be number 2?
For
In
the
which case,
355 widening?
then the Clarksburg widening would go from 2 to 3, and the accelerated traffic signal modernization would go from 3 to 4.
Can we get some context here?
Sure, the Clarksburg related improvements on 355 were new to the letter in 2017. It hadn't been addressed for a long time. The council had just taken action to essentially permanently defer M83 at that point in time. There was no activity on I-270 widening at that time, so knowing that there was a desperate need to improve transportation connections to Clarksburg and that the already developed highway corridor, which is 355, was the most likely place that those could occur, was the rationale for adding this as the top priority because that area was so underserved. There have been changes since that time. Obviously, the state is moving forward on 270 improvements at a pace that wasn't the case. The council, I don't know how it's ultimately going to turn out, but Observation Drive funding was recommended to be retained by the committee. So it is possible that Clapper Road might be a more viable, higher priority at this point, but we wouldn't want to signal to the Clarksburg community that we're less interested in their transportation needs, so we kept it as 2 in our recommendations.
And we got a letter from the city of Gaithersburg. Can you just describe that letter, Glenn?
Well, it basically says make it number 1.
Look at number 1. We have 2 number 1s.
No, we don't want to do that anymore.
That was a joke. That was a joke.
We've done that before. We don't want to do that.
Joke.
Don't do that.
Well, I'm fine with making it number 2. I think that would be great. I feel like the state ought to have capacity to do more than 1 or 2 of these. So.
And Director Conklin, you alluded to the discussion last week that we had regarding the CIP and 355.
Correct.
And I'm not sure you addressed that. What did we?
Not specifically. You funded a facility planning study that would help advance this, which is similar to what we've asked for here. And would,
That's the question. Yeah.
yeah, it's essentially the same effort. We know the state has some planning activity underway, but we haven't been able to figure out exactly what that is, as I sit here now. But you did fund a facility planning study recommended it as the committee for us to take this on. And that would get us ready for a Chapter 30 application for it to go into the design and construction program at MDOT if we have a good alternative coming out of the work we do.
Sure. So given those dynamics, what I would support in a 1, 2, 3 order, continuing with Montgomery Hills as 1, as we all just agreed upon, and then I would take Gaithersburg's request into account and have 117 move into that number 2 slot, and then have that 355 be number 3 because we addressed that in the CIP, and we still have to move forward on that and see how that works out. Just my opinion.
I agree.
Okay, and just to wrap up that part of it, then the accelerated traffic signal modernization would be number 4.
You mentioned the incandescent lights.
There are still incandescent lights on the state-owned signals, yes.
Is that just what's the downside besides just energy efficiency and climate?
Energy efficiency, the failure is dramatic. The LEDs dim, the incandescents go out.
Okay.
So it's just it's a cost and safety implication. It's not just the incandescent, it's the poles and et cetera. Many of them are in a poor structural condition.
LEDs just dim when they fail?
LEDs decay over time and incandescent bulbs.
You have more
go out.
warning. Okay. They don't have a filament. Okay, interesting. Okay.
Can you talk to me about the relative merit of traffic signal modernization? Are those adaptive signals? Is that what that is?
No, these are structural repairs and changes in the technology and the APS, the accessible signals on the state-owned signals. Excuse me, in my view, the larger capital programs are probably a better place for you to put your emphasis. This is a ongoing state program that is
Maintenance and
underfunded.
Operational type expenditure.
We felt it was important to put it in here because we are responsible for the maintenance and we're seeing so many issues with accessibility and safety. But it is not it's not a project, it's many, many little projects.
Okay, that's helpful.
So I think you probably have the right order.
Coming
Well,
out.
I can't really say that till I talk to my boss, but.
Coming out of a statewide fund. Okay.
So under
I think you're on safe ground.
Under Wilmot, I guess the first comment is, in terms of the number one priority, should it be White Flint North and Forest Glen Passageway, or just White Flint North?
I have a question here. I could see it being a problem if we are telling the state, you know, we need you to go get funding for White Flint and for Forest Glen. And then, well, but the county's paying for Forest Glen. It looks like we don't even, like the left hand isn't acknowledging what the right hand's talking about, or whatever. So,
Yeah.
if we are going to keep Forest Glen in there, it might need to say, like, as an expression of our commitment to the importance of Metro, we are funding Forest Glen, and we want you to fund White Flint. I mean, I generally think it doesn't make sense for us to ask for funding for things that we have decided we're going to fund, because then we have to explain why we're asking for something that we've already paid for or are planning to pay for. But if we can contextualize it, then maybe it strengthens our case to get the state funding. I just think it needs to be clear.
I do think, if I remember right, in an earlier hearing, I think you argued that we should fund White Flint while we were in negotiations with WMATA. So,
I did, because I think that we need to show that we are committed to getting this done, and we want them to get it done. So what I'm saying
but
is...
who pays for it is the question. So we can't say we're going to pay for both and then ask for state money for both.
I didn't say we should pay for both. I was saying that we've decided to pay for Forest Glen, which to me is not much of a difference from the White Flint. I don't really see this distinction
Oh, it's a
between
very
the
significant
tunnel. But, well, you know, it's technical to me. To me, it's technical. This is station access. It's all related.
The purpose is the same, but the implementation is entirely different.
Oh, I understand that there are important technical distinctions, but I think the reality is we're stepping up to fund the Forest Glen Metro because we think it's the right thing to do. We think it's needed. We're paying for that whole thing. We're not waiting around for the state to pay for half. With White Flint, we're seeking the state to at least pay for half. We'd like them to pay for the whole thing, and so we're calling that out in the letter. I just think it would be confusing to have us asking for something that we've already committed to funding, and that it's referring to the Forest Glen Metro. I'm not saying we have committed to funding the White Flint, but we're essentially, I'm saying I'm prepared to pay for half of it.
I think on this item, I mean, I wasn't going to address the county contribution to funding on White Flint in the letter. In Forest Glen, I think we can craft language that expresses both the point that we have committed to implement this project, but that this is a drain on our resources
Right.
that could be could be effectively served through dedication of WMATA or state capital resources to this, either because of WMATA has such a broad program to address these issues, or because this has such a nexus to the project that we've asked the state to advance as our number one priority. And we've had both of those conversations over the last 2 years and have decided to include it in our program. But I think there's some language that can walk that line that we can craft for this particular item.
In the case of Forest Glen, there's not just one check that needs to be written, correct?
No, that's correct. And this
Right.
is an independent,
So just because we've indicated that this is a priority for us and we're willing to put up some of our money doesn't preclude WMATA or the state from putting in future money to finish the construction, correct?
correct. And when we had been having a conversation of the build grant, we were considering the county contribution to this as a possible match. We didn't decide to go that route, but there are different ways that project could be constituted. So I think there's a way to serve the purpose you're talking about, which is to put us in the position to compete for the funding should there be a broader conversation about it. And as Councilmember Reimburn is saying, that we are doing our part to improve access to metro stations, which, again, I said last week is about $400 million worth of investment over the last few years in metro station access improvements
Right.
That
Okay.
Metro has made.
that we have made.
We have made, right. Which is
So-
the reality. If we were going to wait for Metro to do those improvements, we'd still be waiting today.
Well, they all started before Metro had a robust capital program available.
They have much more money than they.
Yeah.
and they have different board members.
So the letter, I'm understanding would be that the ask would be for the White Flint North entrance, but pointing out that we are paying for, so far, the entire cost of the Forest Glen passageway, and it is a drain on us.
Yeah.
So, hey, we're already contributing ours, where's yours, kind of thing. The other thing under Metrobus is or WMATA is again, the Metrobus Priority Network for Veersmill Road. And I want to point to the letter that the four of you have signed. I lost it. You've got it in front of you.
And I wanted to just add to the historical record that before there was a new request that Ride-On should do it, there was a previous request that I made with Councilmember Berliner that the WMATA should fund infrastructure for Priority Quarters Network on Bears Mill.
That's true. And Mrs. Navarro had asked for this as well for a long number of years. So you have the letter from...
But I asked for it first. That's what matters.
for you first. Councilmembers Glass, Navarro, Reamer, and Rice asking DOT to cost out what it would take to actually do this kind of service, both on Veersmill Road and on 355. And what I'm recommending is not counter to that. It's basically in the same vein, which is basically put it on the priority letter and ask the state to at least contribute to whatever that cost is as the number 2 priority.
Well, let me clarify a little bit. Clearly, there is a history of advocacy for increased bus ridership, right, and better corridors. And so I applaud everybody who's been advocating over the years, and so here we are at this point in time, and none of that has moved very much with regard to the Metrobus Extra. And so the letter actually, instead of asking for the Metrobus Extra from WMATA, it actually asks for Ride-On Extra, so that right, again, a technical difference, but the same theme keeps emerging throughout this conversation, and even the CIP conversation last week of we have things that we know we really want to do, and other people and other agencies aren't paying for it, so what do? Do we just keep waiting around, or do we become creative? And so this was a creative approach in terms of owning those speedier routes, and so just wanted to clarify that point.
Anyway, so that's my recommended number 2.
But these two things are not in conflict, right?
No.
Right, because one is like streetscape, infrastructure, intersection, that kind of
I
stuff.
think we're both talking the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
The question is if we can get state funds to finally do it. I mean, past administration said no. We have a new sheriff in town. Maybe this would be a good one for that.
Well, and we're asking for it by this request in a different model. We're requesting it as locally operated transit support rather than subsidy to WMATA, which may have a different response from the state.
So do you think it's a better shot just asking for more ride-on assistance to do acquiring buses and shelters and operations for
It's
Veersmill Road?
it's different than our other requests, and it doesn't go into the compact and the complicated politics of the WMATA.
that was my concern with. I mean, I think the ride-on extra is a
better,
good
is that-
fallback, but I think for Veersmill Road, not differentiating of 355, where we have it's almost entirely Metrobus service, it would make sense to actually ask the state to, again, to do this. We're going to be asking the state to eventually, maybe the new administration, help pony up for Veersmill Road BRT.
Well, we've seen from Route 29 that when we expand Ride-On service, they will cut back WMATA service, or they will propose to do that, right?
They are doing that everywhere.
Yeah, I don't know that
They're doing it
that is what is happening, but I don't know that it's causally linked that way. I think their budget process and their overall dynamic are driving to reduction in bus services, and we happen to be improving them, but we made the decisions to do that long before. We had extensive conversation with WMATA about redirecting the resources that might not be needed on 29, which is the Z11, to Veersmill Road for expressly this purpose. And instead of doing that, they have just cut their bus budget by $30 million or something to that magnitude.
So what are your druthers on that recommendation?
Can you frame it for us again?
I'm recommending that the number 2 priority under WMATA be an ask for capital, this is all capital, by the way, it's not operating. Capital assistance to implement Metrobus priority network on Viersville Road, including extension up to Montgomery College on Metrobus.
But I think, as we said, what's the downside?
Sorry?
There's not one, right?
So it would be one is
One and then two. You're
dedicated
at-
funding.
One is White Flint,
Yeah.
and two would
And
be
you're adding a 2.
adding it to.
I think
Had been number
I
2.
bet we're all okay with that.
Sounds good.
Right, okay.
The next item I think I want to back off of now, the Boyd's Transit Station expansion, I understood it as being the money to actually do what we're doing, but it sounds like it's different.
It's different. It's station accessibility, shelters, perhaps platform improvements.
Okay, with that clarification, I agree with the executive, that should still be the number one priority. I thought this had to do with the parking expansion and the bus loop. So, on that one, never mind.
Well, can we not skip, I agree it should stay in there. What, Mr. Conlon, what's your reaction to the letter from MTOC about the importance of prioritizing all-day two-way service and the third rail on the market?
I think that is a big priority.
Right.
I think it's fairly unlikely to be implemented anytime soon. And I would rather see our top priority be something that ends up in direct service improvement as quickly as possible.
It's a countywide priority, though, and not a local priority. And generally, they don't have any trouble saying no to things. So if they see a 1 that they don't like, they'll quickly skip to 2, right?
If you wanted to switch them, then it could be inconsequential what the order of those two things.
Right, we might be arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of the proverbial pin, but generally, we have,
Our record on this letter is pretty pathetic anyway.
it is, well,
I mean, you know, I'd be perfectly honest.
well, until,
What has happened with every administration, Democratic or Republican, is they do what they want to do, and if it's something that they want to do, it's on our letter, they say, see, we're doing what you're doing on your letter.
yeah,
But this is still important because you're expressing what your priorities are.
until we get elected officials involved, not just county, but state level too, and we fight in a unified way for things like the Purple Line, the Watkins Mill interchange that got funded.
We always try to bring in senators and delegates, and you see that in this letter as well. Chris did that. And really, I go back in this letter for 25 years, and there have been very, very few projects, less than one hand, the number of projects that have been
We
added.
should
as
do
a
things
result.
differently.
One was added years ago when gambling was allowed. It was a trade-off for a state senator's vote to get 124 widened.
How about
And
the
that was like
Shady
number
Grove
5 on the.
turnbacks, though? We got the Shady Grove turnbacks in there,
Welcome
and
to
it
Annapolis.
happened.
Well, okay.
Right, we got the public
was one
involved,
that's
the
been-
media involved, and we've,
I'm not saying it's a useless exercise. I'm just saying it's to put more hope in this than there really.
but on the topic of just prioritization, and the number, generally, have favored larger countywide projects over
Yes, and
precise.
generally the ones that have been funded have been smaller in specific locations.
So,
So
fine.
I don't know that it actually matters which sequence you put these in.
Well, okay,
Defer to your wisdom.
on commuter rail, we're talking about commuter rail here. First of all, I think we need to go much bigger on this topic.
I agree.
I think
Yeah.
we put the Purple Line, you know, at the front of our letter for years in the Quarter Cities Transit Way. Then we put WMATA and the funding deal at the front of our letter, and we made it clear that this county has a very strong vision for major transit projects that we want to get funded, and that helped explain the prioritization. I think it's time for us to do the same thing with commuter rail and elevate that to the front, to the top, and spell out a bigger vision, including the through running with Virginia, so Virginia trains can come here and Maryland trains can go there, and so on and so forth. So I would definitely concur that, you know, the overall service increase should be first, but there is a piece missing here that is parallel or, you know, the same thing as Delegate Solomon's legislation, which is we want the state to start actually working on this, and especially on the through running and the CSX negotiations and all of that. So, you know, broadly, I think we need to make a bigger statement about this priority. I'd love to see it go to the front of the letter, and then specifically, I think we could do more here. I think we could add some elements that really make this thing come to life and are timely. You know, right now, the timely conversation is about connecting the commuter rail as a regional network. And Maryland is not yet in that conversation. You know, the governor is yet to grab onto this issue, despite Virginia making huge strides and doing a lot. Maryland, you know, the governor is sort of sitting back, and we've got a few delegates that are championing in the legislature, and we need to help them get traction and momentum. So how could we do that?
And did we have any of this under the previous governor, or was it just weekend service?
No, this was in here previously.
No,
Oh,
no.
previous governor,
The
I'm
actual
not,
service, not just our ink on a page.
I'm not sure.
Well, we had weekend service. I thought we had some midday as well under O'Malley.
I'm not sure what was in there
Anyway.
6 years ago.
Sure, but where we can argue we should restore something that the state actually used to pay for and provide, we might want to do that. And I really think you should reach out to Frederick County. I think Delegate Parrott in particular has an interest in this. Others do. I don't know why the county executive wouldn't and the county council commissioners.
Well, it was in our letter 3 years ago.
It was, yeah. I just don't know where it was before that. I don't.
Oh, yeah. Governor O'Malley, in his very first year, put out a very extensive MARC expansion plan, which was in several phases, and then it disappeared, basically. The pressures of the CTP, it never really happened.
Well, there was a recession, too.
There was that.
Historic
and they built
recession.
the
I remember it
ICC.
really well. We had a lot of special sessions to raise taxes to pay for stuff. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so
So I guess, are you okay then with the?
I think a couple of us are saying
1 through 4 under commuter rail that Chris is saying with the clarification that the Boyd Station expansion will need a little bit more language about under that paragraph as to what specifically we're talking about, but it's really track and.
Can we get some additional language that speaks to the big picture here? And-
Absolutely.
Yeah,
In big picture.
and then move it to the front.
the economic development.
Right.
I wouldn't move it to the front because its geographic impact will always be limited. It affects accessibility to Germantown, Rockville. The stations in between many of them are fully developed. So it's important, but I think the other transit programs that are in here have a broader impact on the county than the commuter rail will. I'm not arguing that there's a lot of potential and that it's important, but I don't think it has more potential than the BRT, the locally operated transit, or WMATA.
I'm not so sure. I mean, I think we have a fairly constrained vision for development around MARC stations because we're still more or less assuming the status quo. But we want to, is there a new station and we want to relocate the White Flint station and there's a whole
That's
development
part of the
strategy?
challenge is that at least under the current construct, they said nothing new without taking something away. So that's been really difficult for people to navigate. So you would be trying to, yes, there is a vision for a White Flint station that could expand access there. There's the potential for TOD in Germantown that could be impactful. The Shady Grove item that the planning board had recommended that we're suggesting should be included here has the potential to be significant, but that's kind of the extent of it.
And a reminder about both these new stations, Shady Grove and White Flint, and the state's had this position for 30 years.
Okay.
If you add a station, then, and you're gonna make stops at that new station, you're gonna take away stops on an existing station. They don't wanna add a net number of additional stops along the line because it slows the entire service.
I think
So,
the
and
point
adding
that I'm
White
trying to
Flint
make-
station
Go ahead.
would definitely reduce or eliminate the station at Garrett Park, for example. If you add a station at Shady Grove, it would likely mean that either further reduced or perhaps elimination of the station at Washington Grove. That's what it means.
I think the point I'm trying to make here is that I think the next big infrastructure project that we need to rally behind is MARC and VRE interoperability and MARC expansion. And I don't think it is endless planning for BRT. And so I would like us to make that point. I want the council to make that point. So I'm comfortable with, like WMATA expansion was at the top of our letter. Obviously a huge impact on Montgomery County, right? Massive, but it was also a regional system. So
You want to move the whole commuter rail to the first above the BRT?
Yeah, I mean, my view of it has, and then it needs to relate to, and I want to get into this, and we can get into it soon, is the 495, 270, that whole conversation. We need to reference that precisely.
That will be. It's evolved since this was drafted.
Exactly, I know. Time has moved on, and we need to say something in this letter that is savvy to what the situation is. But the priority letters over the years have served to communicate to the Montgomery County, transportation community as much as anything about what do we have our eyes on? What's the prize? What are the big things we're going for? And I think the county council could play a real helpful role here, articulating that we have, and it doesn't need to come at the expense of BRT. I probably shouldn't even have said it that way, but that MARC VRE, MARC system statewide, all this stuff fits.
And I completely agree with you that commuter rail has the potential to make a much bigger impact in our county than it does, and I'm happy to draft this language in that way. I just, we are about to open the first system that emerged from the BRT process. We're in design on 2 corridors. We're working on figuring out the financial plan and drawing on outside resources to do it. So there's a lot of potential to move that forward, and it has a broad geographic impact on the county, and I just don't see, at least in 2019, 2020, this jumping to the very top.
Maybe the preamble
But
of the letter can
That's
talk
certainly
about it,
reasonable,
and then in the content.
because there is a lot of untapped potential for the Brunswick line, but I just don't see it eclipsing these other items as we sit here today.
Right. And as you said at the very beginning, when my question, it's unlikely to get funded anyway. This is a long conversation with state.
But there are elements that Councilmember Reamer's talking about that
Yes.
are important that
The
get
potential's
studied. The
tremendous.
through running, the expansions at Union Terminal to accommodate more of the service. There's lots of stuff that needs to be worked on.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we're going to get there when we have more partnerships with Frederick, DC, Virginia, et cetera.
And the final comment I had was, again, under local operating transit support, having as a new number 2 priority, sort of fits into the letter from the 4 council members, to extend ride-on extra service up to Germantown and down to, in my case, down to Bethesda, and looking for state aid to help fund the capital expenditure that would be required. That's basically additional buses and stations, stops. So would you want to have that as a number 2 or not?
Sorry,
This is the bottom, be the bottom of page 2, it'd be a second.
Just adding it. I think it's fine.
Yep.
This would be a second priority in that
I
category.
don't think anybody's against that. You're not against that?
No, I think the communities would benefit from that service if it were available.
Sure.
It's not a substitute for real infrastructure, but it's a good service enhancement.
Right. Okay,
Something now.
great.
um,
Want to go back to the interstate highway program, because Mr. Friedson has this letter from the, referring to the Card Rock Springs Civic Association, so, Mr. Hucker, I think Mr. Friedson would like to talk about that with us.
Yep.
Thank you for indulging me. I appreciate the prior discussion. Just want to echo the points made, particularly about the 355 is the number 2 priority that you just mentioned, the White Flint Second Metro entrance, and particularly MARC expansion. I think the real interesting piece here is that Amazon, this is going to be a site, this station, White Flint Station, that's part of that discussion, would, part of it would be connect to where Amazon might have been, and it literally will connect us to where Amazon is going to be by having a train that connects it. And I think that, to me, speaks to the power of transit and our long-term goals. So I just really appreciate the conversation, although I didn't weigh in. Specifically appreciated, I sent a memo to colleagues. It's specifically reflecting community concerns, particularly in Carter Rock Springs. Citizens Association, you also received a letter from them. It's a request to add some language related to the 495-270 program. There's basically 2 aspects of this. One, that the project be built within existing boundaries within existing rights of way, which has long been our policy, but we have not necessarily put that in writing, and there hasn't been as much of a focus west of the spur as there has been east of the spur, and the other is making sure that the needs of local communities will be reflected in the design of the project. And then an additional mention, as you may recall, at the first presentation of MDOT before the council, I raised the concern of the noise barrier, which dates back to the last expansion in '88, I believe, a promise that was made, a promise that wasn't kept. We got a commitment from MDOT at the dais, and I followed up and got a commitment subsequent to that they would follow through on that commitment of the noise barrier and make sure that noise was part of the environmental impact and the impact on the community, and including that into the transportation priority letter as part of this project, I think will send a really strong message that we're following through on the commitments that we've made to communities and trying to advocate that the state follow through on its commitment and commitments that it has made to the community. So I'd appreciate your support and indulgence on that.
I think the requested language is completely consistent with the executive's view of this project and is consistent with all the comments the department has made during the environmental process. So I have no concern with that language at all.
Sounds good.
Otherwise, I think,
Okay, I have a question. I would like our letter here to refer to the transit ask. It seems like it's missing this very real conversation about how the state project is moving forward and what the county's ask is within that context. And I guess we're not necessarily spelling out what our ask is in this letter, but
We will.
But, so.
Well, it's just.
Needs to be another,
Nonsense.
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the first point I want to make is since we're not doing it in this letter, which was an option, I suppose. I mean, we could have done it that way. We need to do it separately. So can you explain what the process will be to prepare a county ask that is then approved by the county council?
We don't yet know what that process is. We've been told we're going to have negotiations with MDOT about what the contribution to local transit is a portion of managed lanes. We've been told that it will be.
Pause you right there.
Yeah.
So before you enter into negotiations, there needs to be a county council decision as to what our posture is.
I'm not sure of that. I'll have to check on.
I'm sure of that.
Okay.
There needs to be a county council decision as to what we're negotiating for.
I mean, typically the executive negotiates on behalf of the county, so
Right, because the county council has established what the policy is, and then the executive negotiates for it. I don't believe that that has been done. I don't think that the county executive could negotiate on our behalf. I don't think it's clear what our behalf would say.
we'll have to iron that process out. I don't know exactly the structure that would guide that process.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I would like to work with my colleagues to proceed through that process. And I'll ask Glenn to work with you to figure out what the timing should be, but I presume it is something analogous to this letter. It's a clear statement, and it's one that we would,
And it's not even clear to me today that we're going to be negotiating with MDOT versus negotiating with a selected concessionaire or a proposed selected concessionaire. There's a lot to still be figured out here. So I
Understood.
hear what you're saying, that
Understood. I just want
I
to,
can't roadmap that process for you right now.
that's fine, but I am concerned that in the lack of process on our end, the executive is doing what he believes is what, he thinks is the best thing to do. However, I think that the council and the executive need to be aligned on that. And, I don't know, and we're not, we haven't had that actual specific conversation. And so that's just a concern. I want to make sure that it's a county ask, that everybody is in agreement about.
just, if this is wrapping up, just wanted to say one more thing about the process from this point forward. What I'm going to try and do is I'll try to put out the packet later today, or it'll probably come out tomorrow now, given the time, which will summarize what the committee's recommendation is on things where you really can rank. But a lot of the other comments about emphases I'll try to incorporate as well. And then that'll go to the council, and the council on Tuesday will, agree or make changes, whatever. But you won't have a final letter in front of you until after the council session's done, and Chris has a chance to then really write it up. And so my sense is what will happen is that after the council makes its way in on Tuesday, that Chris in the following several days will redraft the letter, and it'll get circulated here. And hopefully, if it needs to be a little bit of wordsmithing, that might have to happen, but.
I'll have to review it with the executive. before I send
Exactly,
it
you
back.
have to review the executive, and it's, because it is a joint letter, both sides have to agree. But it's not like you're going to have a letter in front of you on Tuesday. I guess that's my main point.
Okay. But will the council, okay, and then as long as there isn't a huge difference between whatever the council does see and then the letter, then it doesn't need to go back to the council, but if for some reason there is a.
Well, I think you should see the final version of the letter if you have a lot of this is nuanced, and you might like add a few words here or there to be careful how you want to say things, and it'll be a little bit of a process.
I want to make one quick comment on the planning board's proposal around the Vision Zero and the need for dedicated funding, or which I sort of interpreted as a budget item rather than a dedicated revenue. You're not asking for a tax. You're asking for them to have a part of the budget that's funding these kinds of projects. First of all, I certainly agree. I think, however, that it's the policy changes that are the nearest term opportunity for us. Like the news that they're willing to do a road diet on Old Georgetown Road is not funded out of any distinct budget item. It's a policy shift that's happening, and it plays out through every category, and it's so welcome and so long overdue. So I don't know that we would reference a policy issue like that in this letter, but it's something we ought to consider, that we want them to proceed expeditiously with this, contextual framework that they have, and how supportive we are of that. And also, from there, I think we ought to think a little bit about what we would want them to build. Like in our budget, there is pedestrian and bike infrastructure in many, many projects. We're struggling with really expensive projects. We have the BIPA program, which is modeled on a state, policy area. We could ask them to fund the BIPA, to provide BIPA funding or something. But I think it'd be helpful if you could give to us something that's, small, fundable, high impact that we would be asking them for, rather than just saying sort of generally, we want you to have a Vision Zero funding item.
Well, I think in the planning board's letter, they did reference the improvements on state highways, not specifically picking out any particular highways, and the BIPA program as well. And certainly the work that's been done on Georgia Avenue, I think is a great example of cross-agency collaboration and working to focus on with Vision Zero in mind. I think the planning board, when they look at this, they make similar recommendations to the county as a whole, whether it's for state priorities or not, which is that we have to look at Vision Zero and we have to really try to focus on how much are we spending on Vision Zero, how much of a priority are we placing, and so when there's actually a line item in the budget, then one, you can actually assign projects to it, and you can go after those funds. So I think that's what the planning board was trying to point out, is that that more of those projects, the more you do them, you need to start putting them into a bucket and then putting into a program. And when it's done, when everything is done from a level of effort perspective, it's hard to track. How much is being spent, what is actually being done when you actually have your own CIP item or CTP item, where this is what we're doing on Vision Zero. There's a lot more accountability.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that, but I also would say, like, whenever they do anything in the county, it needs to be in accordance with Vision Zero principles. And that wouldn't necessarily be reflected in a Vision Zero item. It's reflected in whatever that item is. So I think we all kind of know that, but sometimes it gets confusing.
The challenge that I think they're facing, that we see, is that they don't really have the resources to do the substantive or medium-scale improvements we'd like them to do. Things like the mid-block Hawk signals and other things like that. They're budget limited from being able to do that. I
That would
think,
be, exactly, I think specifying, like, that's the kind of project that we want.
right. to
Might
get-
be, certainly that would help me understand what it is that we should be fighting for, is like those kinds of
yeah.
Also from-
tangible projects.
Yeah, also from the planning board's perspective, you know, we have this, the Park and Planning Commission has this mandatory referral process. It works on CIP items. It doesn't work on level of effort. You know, if there's like 5 or 6 different funds that are being used to do a series of improvements, it's much more difficult to say, come in and give us a presentation, we're going to review it. We'd like more flexibility. For instance, the Georgia Avenue improvements, there was a stated desire from our director that a mandatory referral, or at least a briefing, be conducted between both agencies so that the public can get a better sense of what is being planned, and even actually as just a showcase of what are all the things that we're doing between DOT and SHA collaboratively to improve the safety of the corridor from a Vision Zero perspective. So I think the idea, the more items are actually CIP or CTP projects, one, it pulls it into the mandatory referral process and gives the planning board at least more of a seat at the table.
And so you had recommended that, did we act on your recommendation? It seemed like we sort of skipped past it a little.
We concurred with their
We
recommendation.
concurred with it about advocating for a Vision Zero.
Essentially, for having it be a funding priority for the state was how we were reviewing that. Like they have committed money to congestion mitigation and other things, we think they should be committing money directly and for the purpose of improving pedestrian safety on state roads.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Are we good? Great.
All right, Bill,
The bill? I thought we can't do the bill because the staff isn't here.
are they here now?
Christine?
Sadly, they're here.
What else
We could have truncated that last colloquy.
Our schedules are clear.
Although the governor's speaking for.
Maybe yours is. I gotta get back to work. Yours, which one? I guess we're doing the bill. If the staff, you're saying the staff is here?
Ours is.
Okay. Christine, that's fine? Okay.
Good. Agrees with the sponsor, we're ready to rock and roll.
Somebody grab mine.
I don't see any donuts.
You don't have 2 copies of the bill packet.
I do. I was wondering why I did. Cost you $5.
Donuts go well with Starbucks?
All right, this is the hearing on House Bill. Bill 3819, Streets and Roads, Permit to Obstruct Public Rights-of-Way Amendments. Ms. Wellens.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair and council members. Also, if I may, just briefly extend personal thanks to all of our agency colleagues, both for their help with reviewing the substance of the bill and also for their flexibility regarding scheduling. So this bill, Bill 3819, introduced by Councilmember Friedson and has a number of co-sponsors. The purpose of the bill is to improve pedestrian safety, and it specifically relates to Section 49-11 of the code concerning the closures or temporary closures of rights of way, public rights of way, in connection with construction or repair of sidewalks, or repair or construction on an abutting property, or other reasons that there might be, a temporary obstruction in a public right-of-way. So I just wanted to briefly point out to you the sections of the bill where there are truly substantive changes to the law, as opposed to rearrangement or rewriting in an attempt towards clarity for the law, because we did some reformatting that we thought was appropriate to make the law more clear in the long run, but not all of it is substantive. And so I just thought it's a longer bill than it would be if we had focused purely on the exact substance that the sponsor is aimed at. So if you look at Circle 4, lines 52 through 58 of the bill, that is a substantive change where we're saying that when the Department of Permitting Services issues a permit for work that would require a temporary closure of the right-of-way, this is explicitly saying that the permit needs conditions to minimize inconvenience to the public, limit the duration of the closure, and assure public safety. Another new, more that is new substantively appears on Circle 5, lines 84 through, through 102. And these provisions relate to how long a closure can be done without providing a safe alternative path for pedestrians on the same side of the road. And so this is where we kind of really get into the meat of the bill. We're saying that, number one, the executive would be required to adopt regulations regarding this whole process to make it clear. But also when the general rule under the current law is, okay, you have certain time periods in which you can close a sidewalk or shared use path without providing a safe alternative path. 6 months in the case of reconstructing a sidewalk, or for other types of closures, 15 days without providing the safe alternative path. So this would say, in order to extend those time periods, first of all, the executive would adopt regulations regarding that process, but those regulations would have to they would have to limit the temporary closure to the minimum time necessary, be subject to regular review by the Director of Permitting Services to review whether the closure without the safe alternative path remains necessary. And then if there was a finding that there can be a safe alternative path at this point, then the permittee would be required to provide that safe alternative path or terminate the temporary closure. Then the other big change I wanted to point out was just on Circle 7, you can see lines 133 through 135. These provisions are aimed at increasing public transparency by requiring the director to publish copies of applications and permits granted for these temporary closures. So those are kind of the substantive issues that are brought up by the bill. And in the staff memo to you, there are a number of specific issues brought up, including a number that were identified by the planning board. I don't know, would you like to walk through those, or I don't know. Okay. So the first two issues that are identified in the memo, pages 2 and 3, probably could be paired together. Under the current law, you are not allowed to, if you get a permit to close the right-of-way, you're not allowed to use any of that area for temporary storage or vehicle parking. And what the planning board has brought up, and also DPS staff, is that there are situations in which that may not be feasible if somebody is allowed to build up to the lot line, that there might be circumstances in which it might make sense to allow some level of storage in the right-of-way, or even, parking of a vehicle that's perhaps being actively used. And so, one option before the committee is to consider whether to amend the bill to allow, basically would be giving the Director of Permitting Services the flexibility to allow storage and or parking, when the director deems it appropriate. So you could you could amend it to allow for storage, you could amend it to allow for parking, or both, should you wish. That's probably item number 1 for the committee's consideration.
What does the director think? Sorry, yes.
Hi, I'm Christina Contreras with the Department of Permitting Services Right-of-Way Inspection. One of the issues with regard to temporary storage in the right-of-way is, again, when we have a situation where it's, zero lot line, the contractors, whether they're storing, gravel that they're needed as they're excavating, construction equipment, a bucket to pick up concrete and get it to the site, it's needed for them. We have a perfect example outside of our office window at the development here in Rockville. That there are times that they do need to have that initially. And what we would like to do, and we do this now, where we reserve the right to, once a building gets to a certain level, then we say, okay, you have to move all that stuff back in when it's safe. So that flexibility, I think, is needed not just for us, but it is for the construction industry, because it would definitely limit developers with how they can build a building. As to vehicles, we definitely don't appreciate when private vehicles are parked in areas where they're holding parking availability. However, a flatbed truck is a vehicle. There are many vehicles that it takes to construct a site and that are moving in and out throughout a certain period of time. And we're definitely conscious of that, and we're mitigating that better on our end as well. However, we do feel that by removing the fact of vehicles being there, it may limit what we're trying to achieve.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and appreciate DOT, DPS, planning, everybody's support, and Ms. Wellens for all of your hard work and following the bouncing ball on this, what seemed like a very simple change, I still believe is a very simple change. My view in terms of the intent of the legislation, and I am perfectly fine with the planning board's recommendation of, the construction materials. I get that. The purpose of this is safe alternative path. And so if you can figure out a way to create a safe alternative path to allow for pedestrian access, which should be treated as transportation infrastructure, and there's some way to store your materials there in a safe and reasonable way, we should provide that level of flexibility. So I'm comfortable with that. We've gone back and forth, but that seems reasonable to me. I think on the parking question, the problem is there's currently a prohibition in the law right now for certain types of parking. The challenge that we have is what most people refer to as convenience parking. It's not a legal term, but it's not the flatbed truck that is temporarily dropping off supplies that are being unloaded. That happens all the time everywhere, not just at construction sites. The issue is it being used as a parking lot for folks to park all day that then blocks the pedestrian safe access, which is the whole purpose of the bill. So if DPS has specific language of how to differentiate between a temporary drop-off for unloading of materials and somebody leaving, a worker leaving their car there and parking there, or a construction site using the public right-of-way as a parking lot, then I would, as the sponsor, would be totally open to that. As of now, I have yet to see what that would look like, and so I do think that we should have a prohibition, an appropriate prohibition on parking, because the issue is if you're blocking the safe pedestrian access, then you are defeating the entire purpose of the bill, and we currently do have prohibitions for parking, obviously within reason, just like somebody sometimes does loading and unloading on the street. You're not allowed to park in the middle of the street. I mean, there are reasonable differences between that, and I think that should be reflected here. Again, the purpose of the legislation is to clarify and codify our existing code and to treat pedestrian access and sidewalks similarly to what we treat other transportation infrastructure like lanes of traffic, and to allow for parking all day on a lane of traffic would not be appropriate. To allow for somebody to drop somebody off in a safe manner is what we allow, and so that's should be reflected here.
I'll share that, one, let me just set the baseline. I'm not quite sure why we can't do a lot of this when we see other jurisdictions, namely DC. We walk around and they're building all over the place, and people are still able to walk and ride and get around however they deem necessary. What gives me pause with regard to this change is the flexibility of the flexibility, right? And as the bill sponsor basically noted, my concern is that the developers would claim hardship probably every time, and the flexibility that this change is calling for would allow that, thus nullifying the whole purpose. And so that's the Pandora's box that I'm just cautious of, allowing a discretionary, flexible guideline that in the end won't do anything because everyone's going to say they need it.
What do you think of that?
This is Atik Panshiri. I'm the Public Right-of-Way Manager at DPS. I do agree with the hardship you just brought in. I think that's a way that all developers will claim. I'm hoping that when we have already drafted the executive regulation, we will limit those and specify that, okay, under what circumstances we will accept allowing you to claim the hardship. Hopefully that will answer some of those questions. And as Council Member mentioned, we already have it in the law. The law right now as a state is kind of not clear. This way, it will be a little bit more clear than what we already have it. For example, the 6 months closure for the sidewalk repair and replacement makes sense, but does not specify that for any adjacent construction, you can close it for 6 months. So this is a way to clarify it a little bit better.
So there will be parameters put around that flexibility.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, without seeing those at this point, that's comforting. So.
So what are our options?
So where are we with
Okay,
that? So we could,
Rate of flexibility, go on.
so sorry, so you have the option of, you could amend the bill to allow for temporary closures, or to give the director the flexibility to allow in the permit for storage within the temporarily closed area and/or parking.
I would just offer that if a vehicle is actively engaged in the construction activity, it's not parked. So I don't know that you need to include the parking component.
Are those the only parked vehicles? Quote-unquote parked vehicles?
Not if it's being actively used in the construction. I mean, a vehicle running with an operator in it is not parked.
Well, I just want to, I agree exactly with what you've said, but I think I would flip it in terms of the way that the bill is drafted. We should prohibit parking, understanding that a vehicle, actively involved in construction activities is not by definition parked, and that could be codified in executive regulation. So, I think I would posit, based on the conversation and the previous discussions that have happened, that if we accept the parking that is listed, where we prohibit parking, don't include construction storage, material storage, because the safe alternative path will solve that issue, and then you can, code. I mean, this bill was set up to allow you a lot of flexibility in the regs to hash out some of these details, and that's the parking aspect that Mr. Conklin mentioned would allow you to do that. If
And just-
committee members are comfortable with that.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, so the current law does prohibit the parking and storage. So and the bill doesn't change that. So this would be amending the bill to give some greater flexibility. But if you want to leave the law as it is, you wouldn't need to do anything with respect to the bill, because the bill does not change the current law in that respect.
I agree with Director Conklin that if you're actively involved, your vehicle is involved, that is not the intent. I think it's the vehicle that's, let's say it's a fence and you're parking behind the fence outside of the area of work, and you park your vehicle and you go to work for 8 hours. That's what you're talking about. So hopefully we'll clarify that on the executive regulation. And
I think you want the storage.
and also the storage. Right now, the storage not allowed. As Ms. Contreras mentioned, where zero lot line that the construction comes to the property line, there's no room to put the storage in the on-site. So for temporary, for a little while, we use that portion of blocked off right-of-way for storage. I think that gives us a little bit of flexibility in that area. Right now, we don't have it. The consequences will be, if they store it somewhere else, then they have to bring it in on-site. That will impact traffic. That's a little bit more consequential than storing it right adjacent to the construction.
And I would like to add that I do agree with what Mr. Conklin said, just from the fact that I think if we have the ability to clarify it in the executive regulations as to what vehicles constitute you're actively working on the site versus not, I think that would square it all away and make it clear for everybody.
Okay, so keep parking, get rid of storage?
Yeah.
Like you said?
That's okay.
Option 1. Correct?
Okay, so the committee's
that a motion?
recommended
So moved.
we'll remove, sorry. So we'll remove the prohibition against storage so that the director has flexibility to allow that when it's appropriate, but keep intact the prohibition against vehicle parking with the understanding that regulations can clarify that, so a car or truck being actively used.
Yep, is not parked.
Really parked.
Standing.
Stand.
Standing.
Okay, without objection.
Great, so, the next issue in the staff memo on page 3 is item number 3, the geographic scope of the safe alternative path requirements. Under the current law, the requirement to, provide for a safe alternative path kicks in if you're in a metro station policy area, town center policy area, or other area expressly identified in a council resolution. What the bill does is takes out that geographic limitation so that the requirements for the safe alternative path would apply countywide. The planning board is in support of that countywide approach. There was some testimony to the effect that, well, maybe the current areas identified are outdated, and so some speakers were saying, well, the new geographic area should be central business districts. Another option kind of in between having it countywide or just central business districts, there is a potential amendment at the very top of page 4 of the staff memo. And I apologize, but I do need to amend this amendment just a tiny bit based on my conversations with Mr. Orlin. It would be, if you were interested in this amendment, it would be, you would limit, the geographic scope would be in a central business district planning policy area, a bicycle pedestrian policy area, an area within 1/4 mile of a Purple Line station, or an area within 1/4 mile of a bus rapid transit station. In those areas, that would be where, if you adopted that approach, those would be the areas in which you would need to, that the permit applicant would need to be providing a safe alternative paths. So again, just current law, it's limited to these specific, metro policy areas, and some other outdated.
How do we come up with the 1/4 mile from a Purple Line?
Well, the 1/4 mile is, under current law, there, it's 1/4 mile, I'm sorry. The geographic scope under the current law looks at, oh, I'm so sorry.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks. Is that in line with parking restrictions? Walk sheds are larger than that.
It's what Mr. Orlin recommended, and I'm sorry, I should have.
Oh, then it's a
asked him to
crazy
stay
idea.
here.
But walk sheds are larger than that, 1/2 mile, we think at least, right?
David Ansbacher at the Planning Department. Walk sheds could be a half mile. You could do that in many different ways. I think just to defend the Planning Board's recommendation, we should be prioritizing safety for everyone everywhere. Someone shouldn't be less safe because they live outside of one of these areas.
3/8 of a mile.
Right. And furthermore, many of our suburban arterial roads, for example, are some of the most unsafe, have some of the highest crash rates for pedestrians and bicyclists in the county. So to the planning board, this is more than just the areas that are labeled on the top of page 4.
So you want the countywide?
We want the
Or
countywide.
Not the, right.
Right.
Just to be clear. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't feel strongly about this. I think the recommendation, if you expanded it to half mile, which I agree sounds more reasonable, reflects the fact that that's where most of the construction is, because this isn't really just about pedestrian safety. It's specifically about pedestrian safety along construction. A lot of the really dangerous areas are state roads that don't have a whole lot of construction outside of the areas that we're talking about. I think, frankly, it's a distinction without much of a practical difference, I think, in terms of the intensive development that we're talking about, particularly lot line to lot line development, focusing on the urban areas. So I'm comfortable either way, but I do think that if we go with the staff recommendation, going to a half mile, to your point, would make me more comfortable personally. But the bill was drafted as countywide.
So just one clarification. So there certainly are development impacts, and a lot of those are occurring in the downtown areas, station areas, but there are utility impacts and utility closures and detours throughout the county.
That's true, but the bill was drafted largely to avoid most of the utility closure. We work very closely with DPS and DOT and the utilities to make sure that we were allowing as appropriate for utilities which are necessary. So I see that as less of an issue, addressing it, but I think it's a fair point. I see it more as a symbolic question than a practical question, given the focus on construction sites. So I think that's really a policy question of the committee, but I would be comfortable with the staff recommendation at a half mile amendment, but also if you continued the bill as it was drafted, I drafted it, so I'd be okay with that too.
You sure?
I think we're not opposed to the countywide. However, in our opinion, I don't think it's necessary. There are some areas that does not have much of congestions of traffic and less traffic. So is it really necessary to require those stringent requirements? It's also a cost issue. So that may not be fair to all of the Montgomery County. That's our opinion.
Right.
But we agree with the half a mile radius.
Will that create a
makes
staffing
sense.
issue for you? In terms of enforcement?
No, not really.
If it's countywide?
If it's countywide, we do have the enforcement right now. I don't want to speak for Chrissy, but if it is anything, it will be probably minimum right now.
Right, because in a lot of the rural areas, I mean, we just don't even have the infrastructure to support some of it. But it's primarily in the urban areas, all up the, I'll say, I-270-355 corridor. And I think, we can handle it outside of the Beltway, I'll say, or even, north of Rockville. I think with the current staff I have, I'm fine. Inside the Beltway especially, we have one inspector now that we've added dedicated to walking around Bethesda, making sure everything's functional there. And we also have a field supervisor that monitors both Bethesda and Silver Spring. And so we're getting greater enforcement there. We have looked previously at having a staff person in Silver Spring as well. And so that may be something that as time goes on, we possibly will need to explore.
I'm okay with the defined areas within a half mile radius.
Amendment with half mile around Purple Line? Okay, without objection. 4.
Issue number 4 relates to recommendations that the planning board made concerning the safety of bicyclists. The planning board suggested that safe alternative paths should be provided for bicyclists if a bikeway in the public right-of-way is closed. And they also suggested that where the bill provides that the permit closing the right-of-way has to minimize inconvenience to the public. The planning board suggested that the public, quote-unquote, be defined to include pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit users. And I don't know if the
Doesn't the
planning
public
staff-
already include pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit users? I would have thought they were part of the public.
I think that's a very fair interpretation, that they would be part of the public. I think the planning board just wanted that to be,
Clearer.
right, spelled out.
Just to speak to this a little bit, the legislation is calling out sidewalks, of course, and shared use paths. It's not calling out separated bike lanes or other bicycle infrastructure.
So saying this would help be clear that we also mean that.
Correct.
I mean, from the DOT perspective, we think it appropriate for the law to reference the need to maintain bicycle facilities and defer to the regulation. In which way that happens, it could be combined with walkway in limited circumstances. It should be driven by the nature of the facility that's interrupted, the utilization and the competing demands. I don't think you can prescribe all that in the law, but referencing the need to preserve continuity of bicycle facilities, I think, is important.
Okay.
Car facilities too.
We have traditionally maintained the car facilities. I think the intention of your bill is to make sure that the others are retained and
But while you're ahead. I think without objection.
Okay, so that is the amendment to define the public to include pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit users. But it won't be an exclusionary definition either. It will say, the public includes these folks, but we're not going to limit it to them. Is that how you want it to be crafted?
The public including, yes.
Yes, okay.
Right.
Got it. Thank you.
Not exclusively those people, right.
Okay. The number 5 might be an issue for planning staff to address, just in that the planning board had recommended shortening the time periods in which a temporary closure could exist without the provision of a safe alternative path. Right now, we have the 6 months, a 6-month time period for purposes of sidewalk reconstruction or repair, and 15 days for any other temporary closure. Those closures can exist, once they go over those time periods, they have to have a safe alternative path. That's under the current law, and the bill does not change those time periods, but planning was suggesting that that the time periods be shortened.
So just to chime in here, so 6 months is a very long time to experience a pedestrian detour and having to cross, if you're trying to walk along the side of the road, exposing yourself to traffic 2 times as you cross to get back to the same side of the road. 6 months is a long time. We did look at what other jurisdictions in the region are doing. Alexandria, it's 7 days. DC typically does not have a time period. They don't want closures at all, but if there's a real need, they'll entertain that.
So a big purpose of the bill was to clarify and codify what we already have, and then to strengthen it to make sure that we're treating the pedestrian access and bicycle access and other access the same way that we do for cars. I think that the comparison of 6 months to 7 days is not accurate. The real comparison would be the 15 days to 7 days. The 6 month is for recreating a sidewalk. If there has to be a new sidewalk put in, I mean, there are timeframes that are established. There's also a waiver for extenuating circumstances in here. You don't want to make it so stringent that we have to always fall back and default to the waiver, because then it softens the bill that's intended to strengthen this process. I think that the 15 days is appropriate. I think that allowing for the 6 months, which is only used in, it's basically a renewal. You have to be renewed. Currently, that hasn't been done as much as we would like. It hasn't been clarified. So, I think the bill as is drafted is appropriate. It balances the practical realities, because if you don't have a time limit like DC has. You basically just provide virtually unlimited flexibility to the department to determine what is and isn't reasonable. I think that doesn't set community expectations as it should. What this is trying to do is not only make it a more strengthened process, but also to make it more consistent so that residents can have an expectation of what to expect and businesses can have an expectation of what to expect. So I appreciate the thought process. I think we agree in the spirit of this, but I think from a practical standpoint in the extensive conversations with the departments and how this actually would be implemented and what impacts it would actually have, I think keeping the bill as drafted would be the appropriate way to go.
And DPS's position is also in line with the council. 15 days is sufficient and it's fair.
Right, without objection.
Under issue number 6, or I'm sorry, item number 6 on page 4 of the staff memo, identify some other issues that the planning board brought to light as items that potentially could be addressed in the legislation. They brought up that there are, special provisions needed with respect to auto messaging devices for individuals who have low vision or no vision. Also, their planning indicated that there should perhaps be some special provisions regarding intersections and covered walkways. I'll say, kind of from my staff perspective, I do think that there's the flexibility that those particular issues could be addressed via regulation. Obviously, it's within your purview to add specific amendments along, addressing those subject matters, but there's not, a specific amendment that's before you on those issues. But I wanted to let you know that they have been brought up.
Let me say, about 2 weeks ago, I attended a meeting of the Commission for People with Disabilities, and we engaged in a very lengthy conversation about the work that you all do and the work that we discuss nearly at every committee session. And there is more conversations that need to be had. And so at this point, I would be comfortable knowing that I've addressed this, right? I've thrown this out into the universe for everyone else to pick up on, and right, well, metaphysical talk. And so, and then when this passes, let's go back and have that conversation, because I certainly don't want to speak for the members of that commission and the communities they represent, but it is vitally important that this conversation be inclusive to them.
Just as a reminder, in our work session last week, the committee recommended approval of a facility planning project to deal with better accommodating the needs of this community, both in the final design and the construction phase can be a component of that.
Beautiful.
Issue number 7, the bottom of page 4 of the staff memo, a number of speakers mentioned that it should be clear under the legislation that existing projects are, for lack of a better term, grandfathered. And so in order to do that,
Everybody's good with that.
is everybody okay with that? Okay, great. We'll just do an uncodified section saying, basically, this is perspective.
Yep.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. And then, okay, I was going to say last but not least, second to last but not least, number 8 on page 5 discusses the applicability of the bill's requirements to county projects in the course of working with DPS staff and their attorney and reviewing this bill. It became clear that in some instances, a county construction project, such as a reconstruction of a county parking lot, might be subject to the permitting requirements here. Sometimes they might not. So this potential amendment under item number 8 here would be to clarify that they are, that when it's, basically a county project, that these permits are still required.
Right. I think we're fine with that.
And then, last but not least, number 9, there are some potential clarifying amendments, and,
You want to comment on that?
oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. So there are these are essentially non-substantive clarifying amendments are captured under item 9 here. We wanted to, in discussions with DPS, it became clear that there might be some situations in which there's an obstruction of the right-of-way that most people would consider permanent, and their specific example was a sump pump. It's removable but permanent, and so there's an amendment here to allow for a sump pump, basically, without the provision of a safe alternative path, because we don't think it's it's probably not anybody's intent to require a safe alternative path. This was basically requested by their lawyer to make everybody feel comfortable that they can
Without objection.
have sump pumps. And then the other point, which I think was very important based on DPS's staff comments, were just kind of making sure that the language in this section is consistent with the fact that DPS issues permits for work, not for like temporary closures per se, if that makes sense. So they're issuing the work for the construction that, in connection with that, there's a closure. We just wanted the wording to not be misleading in that regard. So that's the other clarifying amendment.
Without objection.
Those are all the issues identified in the staff memo. I don't know if there are other issues that anybody wants to raise.
I don't think so. Move the amended bill.
As amended.
Approve it. Okay, without objection. Thank you, Christine. That was awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you.